Revelation 3467. From the 6th and 7th of April 1945. Intercourse with the spiritual world. Any contact with the spiritual world is beneficial for the soul as soon as it takes place in purest spiritual striving. Thus the human being longs for truth and knowledge if he strives to gain advantage for his soul and does not think of earthly goals or desires. And therefore it is only beneficial for the human being if he seeks to gain an insight into the spiritual kingdom, for he will then be given information from the spiritual side according to his desire. His soul will always find nourishment, that is, its hunger for spiritual knowledge will be satisfied, because this is the activity of the beings in the spiritual kingdom to distribute knowledge. But this contact with the spiritual world can only be established in firm faith in the latter. If this faith is not present, then no answer will sound from the kingdom of the knowledgeable, but God-opposing forces will seek to exert their influence on people by confusing their thinking, thus consciously covering them with error in order to suppress their belief in a kingdom of light. Yet spiritual forces are always at work which want to take hold of people's thinking, for the battle between light and darkness never ends, and the human being's will itself determines the outcome to his soul's advantage or disadvantage. If the human being wants truth, if he wants enlightenment about spiritual life, then the forces of the kingdom of light are powerful and they displace the forces of darkness, for if he seeks the truth he seeks God. But if the human being pursues earthly goals, if he tries to utilize his knowledge in an earthly way, he will be seized by the forces which want to increasingly alienate him from the spiritual kingdom. And thus the required knowledge is offered to him in a form that it does not satisfy him or does not let him recognize the error he is falling into. And thus the desire for truth is decisive, which is why the human being himself is always responsible for what is offered to him, because he himself calls upon the forces which want to communicate with him through his desire. But God's will never prevent contact with the spiritual world, for every thought is an initiation of this contact, every thought is an establishment of contact with spiritual forces which are always ready to answer people's questions. But just as people on earth can have valuable or shallow conversations and thus enrich their knowledge accordingly, so in the spiritual world the thought material which people desire is also conveyed to earth. Valuable spiritual knowledge to seekers, those who desire truth, and spiritual material which lacks truth or is useless, which likewise reaches people in the form of thoughts who are only earthly minded and do not strive spiritually. For the human being's will itself determines the spiritual knowledge he receives. It can bring unimaginable blessings, but it can also be just as harmful and detrimental to the souls. And this is why conscious contact with the spiritual world is only worth striving for when the desire for truth permeates the human being. For the earthly-minded person, however, it can be a danger, and it is therefore more advisable to refrain from it in order to make it more difficult for the forces of darkness, which seek to completely darken his spirit, to exert their influence. For the soul's state of maturity is decisive as to which forces approach the human being and which spiritual knowledge they bestow upon him. However, the human being also enters into unconscious contact with the spiritual world as soon as he is thoughtful and raises questions which are then answered mentally. Yet this unconscious contact is less dangerous because the human being believes himself to be the originator of his thoughts and therefore does not attach much value to them, whereas more credence is given to the manifestations from the spiritual kingdom, which always signifies a danger for people to whom the dark forces have access. But the person who strives towards God and seriously desires the truth is protected from these forces by his desire. He can listen, he can ask. He can listen, he can ask and desire answers, and he can always be certain that he will only be instructed by knowing forces. That God himself will supply him with the truth through them, because he seriously desires the truth, and thus also God, who is the truth himself. Amen.